Hello, today is August 5th, 2022. This is the regular scheduled meeting time for the City of North Bend's Historic Landmark Commission. I am Chelsea Schnabel, the city's acting Historic Preservation Officer and City Planner. Today, I'll share a presentation by Oregon Main Street on the basics of building codes on Main Street. Oregon Main Street is affiliated with the Oregon Parks and Recreation Department and is a Main Street America coordinating program. The City of North Bend recently started their own local North Bend Main Street program. The primary focus of this program is on downtown revitalization. The Main Street approach is a unique preservation-based economic development tool that enables communities to enhance downtown and neighborhood business districts by leveraging local assets. Through a comprehensive incremental strategy, the Main Street program aims to address the variety of issues and problems that challenge traditional commercial districts. One of these issues is how to make building code compliant positive changes to older and historic structures without creating a huge cost burden on the property owner. This presentation addresses standard and alternative compliance methods for older and historic buildings. So, without further ado, I present to you Oregon Main Street's presentation on the basics of building codes on Main Street.
Mike was an early leader as well in inspiring me with energy efficiency of historic buildings. A lot of what I know about that goes back to some sessions that I was able to sit in with Mike, and that he had given some presentations at the state and national level. He is a very well respected member of the Main Street community in the preservation world. So it's really wonderful for you to be able to join us today, Mike. So thanks so much for your time. And I do want to plug, Mike has been working on a building codes for Main Street's workshop series for code enforcement officers. We've sent out the information over our listserv. I resent it yesterday as well. And so really encourage you to get that information out to your local folks and encourage them to attend that particular session. So with that, Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Sure. Well, thanks, Sherry. Thanks for letting me participate in Oregon Main Street again. I've been out there a couple of times doing the Upstairs Downtown program, and so I wear multiple hats in the preservation field, and have been on various kinds of task force and agendas. And on my private consulting side now, Upstairs Downtown is a program I do with Dan Carmody, and that really works on trying to promote the reuse of the often vacant upper floors of downtown buildings. And I think one of the things I came to realize out of that is the building code and issues with that were one of the key barriers and issues that we needed to advance training on, because it just kept coming up. And Joe may not remember this, but there was a Main Street Architects meeting some months ago, maybe a couple years ago, and Joe was discussing in a very dramatic manner the problem he was having with code officials, let us say. And I said, Joe, let's put together a task force and let's look at Main Street buildings from the code world. And I was wearing my APT hat, the Association for Preservation Technology, which is an international organization of kind of experts on building materials and the technical side of building science. And we have a Codes and Standards Technical Committee, which I'm co-chair. So with Joe's enthusiasm, we put together a Main Street task force. We met for about a year and said, okay, I think we're ready. We've got a lot of information we've gathered, but what we need to do is to spread this information widely. So Joe and I put together a program for the National Main Street Conference. Last week, I was in Cincinnati for the National Association of Preservation Commissions meeting, and basically I've made it a part of my outreach effort to really promote what we need to do with building codes to affect better historic preservation, both on Main Street and in the larger world of historic preservation. So Joe and I and one other of the state Main Street designers, Jamie Crawley from Texas, did a program at the National Main Street Center in Richmond, the national conference. And so the presentation I'm giving you today is somewhat our presentation we did in Richmond with some tweaks and stuff I've added based upon the coming training that we're going to be doing nationally. So that's kind of a background to this and what I've got to show today. So the three of us presented a program. The third part of the session was on accessibility that Jamie Crawley did, and I've deleted that today, so I'm not going to touch on to the accessibility code issues, which is another component of Main Street design. And our coming national virtual workshop, we're actually going to have a whole 1-hour session on accessibility that goes and good case studies and examples of meeting that. So if you're doing national training, the learning objectives is part of the kind of format for continuing education, but we really want to talk about how rehab codes work and how these model codes get adopted and work with both rehab and property maintenance. And then we're going to dig a little into what are some of the key issues with Main Street buildings. And then I'm going to present some things that you can do locally and how you can work with, you know, the advancement of codes, including amending them, which we're actually kind of seeing a lot of work on that around the country. So I'm today mostly wearing my APT hat, and the Association for Preservation Technology is basically about a 2,000 member organization, primarily architects, engineers, professionals in the world of building materials and science. And it's a joint Canadian-American organization, and actually have an international membership with it. We've got an Australian version, et cetera. So we cover a lot of the topics, but within APT is a separate subcommittee on codes and standards. And I'm a co-chair of that, along with Marilyn Kaplan, who's a preservation architect out of New York. And we're really gathering the information and putting things together to actually propose code changes that can help, and working with various task force by topics. And the Main Street Task Force, I'm happy to report, is the #1 task force in our code subcommittee group that's really advancing things. So hats off to our Main Street Task Force. This is primarily people who are Main Street design staff within the various state programs around the country, but we've expanded beyond that. Joe obviously is with the Wisconsin program. Nick is with the Washington State SHPO office, and Larry Lucas is in the Colorado with Main Street Design, but the others are mostly APT professionals that we brought into this. So our technical committee is really getting some deep roots into it of people that have good understanding of the codes and use them. Chris Root from Wisconsin was the head code official for the city of Milwaukee. And he's now really on the preservation team. This is his exciting new part of this world of the built environment that he wants to work with. So we're really bringing together great national expertise to this subject. Our focus on code issues has largely been around which kind of code do we start with. Life safety is the key one that mostly is the issue, and we're going to dig down deeper into that. Accessibility does come up, and we have separate program on that, and I'm not going to go as far into that today. I'm going to touch into the energy conservation code because I think this is a big issue that's coming forward that we're just now starting to see the overlap between this as people start to implement things. And in our work, we are really working to find case studies, and our technical code workshop that we're doing, our virtual workshop, we're going to present case studies. And we actually have separate funding available to publish our case studies. So just as Joe was saying, look at our book from Wisconsin where we've got design examples. We hope to next year have a place where you can go on the web and see a dozen different code scenarios on a 1-story, a 2-story building, a 3-story building, how many exits and life safety, whether it's sprinklers or not, and get the code data. So we really want to share this information and put it out for everyone. And we've actually developed a Excel spreadsheet on one of the code methods that we're sharing. So we basically got going in 20 during COVID, and 21 we developed, and now this year in 22 we'll have our virtual workshop in 2 weeks. So you've probably seen this flyer going around. I'm one of the few people that can answer the question of where is this picture from? Anybody want to guess? The chat room? Because do you think it could be just about anywhere? Because it could be. Well, it happens to be Council Grove, Kansas, and I was driving through there going to a Kansas Main Street program on a beautiful Sunday afternoon. There's cars parked downtown, the sky was perfect, and the buildings were lined up. So this is our poster child for our code conference session. The most typical two-story Italianate Main Street buildings from the mid-19th century. So what came out of our effort is this 3-day workshop on building codes on Main Street. It's virtual, so we're going to be across the country. The price we think is very affordable, and we have a special rate if you're an APT member, a Main Street member, a Main Street community, or a government, meaning a code official, etc. So relative to other conferences, this is a very good price for the amount of training you're going to get. And we chose this interesting model of meeting from 10 to 3 Central Time each day, so that if you are in the West Coast, that's 8 in the morning, and then you'll get your afternoon free. If you're on the East Coast, you start at 11. And so basically, it's 4 hours of the middle of the day each day, and then you basically can still get some work done during the day. So we hope this model works to serve as a national audience. And it's not too late to sign up. So all of this, we have to give credit to our sponsors and supporters. The Historic Preservation Education Foundation stepped up to the plate early on as our support for this, and the National Center for Preservation Training and Technology will publish the case studies. So, and the National Main Street Center, or Main Street America, they're changing their brand name, obviously, is a cooperating partner in promoting this. So I think we've got 250 people signed up already for this virtual workshop coming up in a couple weeks. Now, that's the background, the big picture, where we're going with this training. Let's dig a little deep into Building Codes 101. What codes apply? And across America, most of you work in an area where your community has adopted some version of the International Building Code. And the International Code Council, which is a US-based organization, develops these codes. The IBC is the most basic building code, the one that most places use. The International Existing Building Code is the principal document that we're working with historic buildings, and it has a chapter on historic buildings. And then the International Energy Conservation Code deals with the issues of retrofitting buildings, and when you do that, what you do to make them more efficient. And the Energy Conservation Code is rapidly becoming stricter and stricter on energy issues, and that's probably a good thing in the long run. So anyway, this is the code universe that most of you start with. In most states, the state adopts a code and says this what applies within our region, or in acceptable municipal boundaries where there's a code standing. In some of your states, individual communities adopt the code, but the ICC is a model code organization. It creates the models. They're updated on a 3-year basis, and then the unit of government adopts that model and typically adopts it with amendments that applies. So for most of you, you have some version probably of the IEBC that you're working with. They come out on a 3-year basis and are updated. So the 2021 version is out. Communities generally lag in adopting them. So it is not uncommon to have a community now still using the 2012 or 2015 version because the city council hasn't officially updated it. The states are generally more frequent on the update than our municipalities. So that's the way it kind of works. The IBC covers fire protection, but there are also separate plumbing codes, mechanical codes, accessibility codes that come into play. So the International Existing Building Code mostly covers the life safety aspects of the code and structure and doesn't get into the other systems. So those are separate adopted codes. Plumbing, in my state, the state of Illinois, adopts its own plumbing code. In your state, you're probably using the International Plumbing Code. So within the International Existing Building Code, there actually is a separate chapter for historic buildings, which is actually quite useful and has a lot of little technical guidance in there. Now, something that comes up here on this statement at the bottom, building codes are separate from zoning ordinances. I want to talk about this because there's often a lot of confusion about this. when you apply for a permit to do something to a downtown building, you're going to go and have the zoning office go, is your building zoned for that? And generally in downtown, you're zoned for just about everything that would apply to most of the work that we're seeing. But zoning on a basis, a zoning ordinance may say if your building's vacant for more than 6 months, you have to update your zoning application to validate that the zoning is correct. That is not the same as updating your building to meet the building code. The building code generally is written that your baseline isn't attached to zoning. Your baseline is the last known legal use of the building. So when you're applying for a building code, there's no mandatory upgrade if you're using the same occupancy, even if it's been vacant. So the building code's based upon a tradition and legal occupancy, not the zoning ordinance. And it's sometimes confusing, and sometimes local administrations try to make the zoning ordinance be a trigger to higher levels of work when it shouldn't be. Now, the international existing building code is one code, but because it was made up of combining 3 different model codes, what happened is the 3 different model codes all had different ways of working, and when they made the new IEBC, they basically took the old codes and made them different compliance paths. So within the existing building code, you can comply by the prescriptive method, which is a modern method, most like what we would use for new construction. You can use the work area method, which is actually the most appropriate for historic buildings, and that's where the historic building chapter is. Or you can use a performance calculation for life safety, which I'm going to talk about. So I'm going to talk about these in a little more detail. The most important thing you should know about this right up front, though, is the decision of which code path to use is determined by the architect. So the owner and their team say, we want to use the compliance method of prescriptive, and we're going to work with that, or the performance. And what we find, though, is that local code officials are often most familiar with the prescriptive method, and they prefer to use that. And if most architects are familiar with it and use it, they'll try and work with that. So one of the reasons why we're really doing this training is that we want more design professionals to know about these alternative methods and approaches, the work area and the performance method, because both of them have advantages for existing buildings. Now, you are typically, my audience today, I'm assuming you're Main Street directors, you're responsible in the community, you're going to kind of want to know what is this stuff about codes. Some of you are working with programs to maintain inventories about your buildings and information about them. So your information about the buildings, how big are they, their current use, occupancy, type of construction. Some of this could be useful, again, for an owner who's looking at rehabbing, because you may have some historic data on the former occupancy of the building and its historic designation or not. So if you're maintaining some sort of inventory of buildings, think about them from what fields are in your inventory that might be useful from a building code standpoint. Probably you don't have construction type on your inventory if you're looking at occupancy issues, but maybe that's something that would be useful to you. Interesting, I haven't talked with the folks in Maestro for a while on their sort of proprietary downtown inventory software, how far they go on that. But the code, in its most basic way, works from occupancy type. So we have evolved building codes over the last 100 years to very carefully start with the assumption of what kind of use is in there, and basically that use drives the different levels of safety that are needed. High hazardous use is going to have lots more things that are needed and required, as do assembly use, where you've got large crowds gathered and things. Typically low-end uses with not a lot of people, storage, and mercantile and business uses are oftentimes very low-end as well. But business and mercantile uses can be higher depending upon what you've got in them. So this is their, when you get together with code officials, I'll tell you that they rapidly move into talking in acronyms. And so I see here that there's 4 different levels of residential use from R1 through R4. It's always bothered me. R1 is the highest use of residential, larger multifamily and institutional, whereas R4 is sort of the lowest end. I think they made it wrong when they did it, but they got the numbers wrong, but that's the way it is. So your code people know and will speak in acronyms like this. You're an A2 or an A1, so be ready for that when you get into with your code official. Now, this is a very important quote, and it's from the International ICC's Building Department Administration book. It's kind of a textbook for building code officials. And I don't generally read my slides, but this quote's worth your knowing. The repair, alteration, addition to, and change of occupancy in existing buildings are in many cases more complicated to design and regulate than the construction of new buildings. This is a very important statement because it's recognized widely within the building community that it's actually harder to regulate existing buildings than new buildings. With new buildings, we can get very precise formulas and apply them, and there are so many different ways things happen in existing buildings that it's really hard to make any existing building exactly like we would do it if it was new. And so if your building code trigger says you're supposed to do it like a new building, we know it doesn't always work with existing buildings. So there's a need for a lot of technical alternates and judgment calls in getting there. So that's why it's harder. And it's more complicated because most building officials and designers are familiar with the new formula and prescriptive requirements. So we've got this perception that only the perfect as the new version is safe when there's a lot of ways that gray areas can be covered. So there is flexibility needed. We call it alternative technical standards in the way, but the codes aren't very good at that. If the code says you need to have a 2-hour fire rating and you have only an hour and 40-minute fire rating, there's no place in there where it specifically says, well, that's close enough. The reason we talk about the performance method is it gives you some math to do that. But the code never gives the code official dimensional tolerances to say, is it close enough? And we think that's a deficiency in the codes. In our work, we're promoting the idea of allowing some dimensional tolerances that are within reasonable range to help make that. One of the biggest triggers that's come up is change of use, or technically the word is change of occupancy, because the code language is often written that if you change the occupancy of a building to something that has a higher safety threshold than what was previously there, the language that code official typically uses is, well, then you got to make it like a new building. And we know that's impossible to do. So change of occupancy has been one of our biggest issues with downtowns on the upper floors. And that's kind of partly my world of upstairs downtown. That's why the code issue has become such an important part for us. We've also found across the board that your local code officials do not get nearly as much training available to them on the use of existing building codes. Fire inspectors may be more so because they look at occupied buildings, but the typical code official, most of their training is on new construction.
Mike, now, there was one question in the chat a couple slides back. The business and mercantile category, would you colloquially explain that as professional services versus?
Yeah, okay. Yeah, business generally means office use, whereas mercantile means retail use. So within those occupancy types within the code, mercantile, retail. And then there's some very gradations within that because it's all about what you've got that you're selling. But businesses is generally office. So if that helps, office or store, mercantile or business. So business equals office, mercantile equals store. Hope that helps.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks, Mike.
So I said there are 3 primary methods within the IEBC: the prescriptive path, the work area, and the performance. There's also legally the use of the code that applied when the building was built. That doesn't work very well for an 1880 building. Might work pretty well for a 1980 building. So if you can say, hey, I'm working with the code as the building was designed and working with that, legally that's sort of allowed under this path of the ICC. The historic building chapter, which is the repairs component, and there's a bunch of these. Those are all technically part of the work area method. So the work area method has some things, but technically the historic building chapter applies to that. There is, when you apply the existing building code, it also references standards that are in the fire code, the energy conservation code, the building code. So you can't just buy one code book. You've got to have a suite of code books to work from. Good news for all of you is the I codes are all available online in chapter format from the International Code Council. So the Code Council makes their codes available online, but it's not the friendly, easy to use version. So if you're a professional, you're going to buy the advanced copy, which is text searchable and has a lot more flexibility. If you're just wanting to look up something on the code, you can actually see the text by chapter from each of the codes online. So iccsafe.org. So the ICC lets you, as a general public, look at what the language is in the code. You can't copy and paste it. You can't work with it a lot. You can't use it fluidly, but you can see it. And so that's good news. Now, one of the really great things that happened in the move to the IEBC from the previous codes was the way in which they stepped up what the owner was doing as elected work versus what would be required if you did more work. And in the old code, the old versions, the code basically said if you spent more than 50% of the value of the building, you had to make it like a new building. Well, what if you spent 25%? Then what? There was no gray area in between there. It was kind of like all or nothing. What this code does is it raises a series of triggers, and the more work you're going to do, the more then are the mandatory things that come with your work. So it's more proportional. And this works very well if you're not changing the occupancy. So if you're just doing repairs, it's pretty easy to work with the International Existing Building Code. Repairs with like materials are permitted with historic buildings. Then there's alterations 1, 2, and 3. And alteration 3, it gets to more than 50% of the building area, and it could be got rehab, but it's still within an alteration. And so if you don't change the egress requirement or the occupancy type, you can do a gut rehab and work with your builder on that in alteration level 3 typically. So generally, I want to give a lot of fairness to the IEBC on the way in which it works with existing buildings and continued use. However, once you hit change of occupancy, now it's a much different chapter and you don't get much breaks for historic buildings. So change of occupancy still drives it's still a big driver on Main Street downtown when you're doing a change of the second floor. Now, just to dig a little deeper on this staggered work of the alterations, repairs means in kind, and it states that you can repair anything that's historic with like materials, and the only exception is you can't use lead paint or asbestos containing materials. And if you have to replace glass, you can't put non-safe glass in doorways and display windows below a certain dimension. So there's a couple of things on glazing, but generally like things are permitted. And most of these levels of alteration can generally be done without a licensed architect stamp on the drawing. It's be done with the local builder, because if you're not changing egress and any use requirements that are in demand, it's easier to review. So that's actually pretty good. Now, once you get into new additions, that's a separate chapter, and new additions are treated as if it's a new building. So new additions, you don't get any breaks. You got to design it to what the new requirements are. Now, the biggest issue that we have seen for complications is in fire safety. And fire safety, the triggers are what type of occupancy, so assembly, and hazardous use. And you typically are not going to have many hazardous use. That's really industrial things. But you might have an assembly occupancy, more than 50 people in a room. So that's higher hazard. So that's going to be an issue. But the codes are really, the factors that are weighing in are what's your exit capacity in terms of number and size of exits and travel path. What's what we call compartmentalization, the fire ratings, passive controls. A 1 hour rated wall assembly, a 2 hour separation between the first and second floor, a 30-minute door. These are compartmentalization, and these are old systems in place to basically use what has worked very well historically. Compartmentalization was the primary residential code system of fire safety well up into the 1970s. Then we added detection and alarms, and pretty much smoke detectors are required everywhere. It's a baseline. It's important. It's the most important safety feature for fire safety you can have, and they're inexpensive, easy to install. Lastly, though, is sprinklers and fire suppression systems, which typically tend to be the most costly system to install and the most difficult one, where we find probably the most issues with the use of the building code and costs. Now, if you have a 3-story and more building, the building code typically says you need 2 exits. There are some exceptions and ways to round that and working with that. So 3 stories and above, you're typically going to need 2 means of egress. 2 stories, you can have up to 4 units with 1 means of egress. And if you put sprinklers in the building, you can have longer travel distances, but sprinklers don't give you any breaks on the exiting, which I find somewhat odd. I think there's some push to basically say, if you put sprinklers in, you ought to get some breaks on the exiting, and there's some national stuff coming on that. It's interesting we're tracking it. Now, there is a whole separate chapter on change of use, or actually, the technical term of art in the code is change of occupancy. So you can have a use within an occupancy classification. Like in residential, you've got 1 and 2 flat, and that's R3. If you go multifamily, that's R2. So that's a change of use from R3 to R2. Change of occupancy is when you go to a different type of occupancy. So the code classifies use and occupancy slightly different. And the code has some hazardous categories that it attaches to means of egress, height and areas, and exposure of exterior walls. Most of these are not going to affect you, but means of egress is the one that we see the most issues with. A sprinkler system, when it's installed throughout the area where a change of occupancy occurs, is the most common interpretation you're going to get from a building official. So if you have an early meeting with your building official and you say, we want to change the occupancy, do not be surprised if they say, well, then you're going to need a sprinkler system, because that's kind of been the baseline sense of the trigger point. There's some ways to work with improving the safety without that, and that's where we know about the flexibility in the code now. One note about change of use: vacant is not a use. So if something has been upstairs, hasn't been used for decades, and there's something storage, warehouse as a use, but vacant is not a legal use. It's just a temporary sort of condition. The term of art would be, what was the last known legal use? And so if you go upstairs and it has been occupied by 40 years, but there's a kitchen up there, well, that probably was residential. And if you use your city directories, you can research when was the last time somebody lived up there. One of my favorite things to do when I go upstairs and look at a building that literally hasn't been lived in or used for years, is I look around to see if there's an old calendar on the walls or newspapers or something sitting around that has a kind of a date on it to go, wow, when was the last time somebody occupied this? And I was once in a building in the 1980s, and there was a closet full of clothes from the 1930s. When was the last time somebody lived there? And somebody left in the 30s, left a closet full of clothes and never came back. And, so it happens. Something really interesting in this use issue: the California Historical Code allows any known prior use to be determined, to be used for a basis of what is the use today. This is very interesting. So if you have a second floor that hasn't been occupied for decades and it was last in office, but you find out that when the building was built in 1910, there was an apartment upstairs, under the California Historic Building Code, you can say, okay, there was a prior use of an apartment up there, so if I'm going to put an apartment up there, there's no change of use trigger or change of occupancy. So that's actually a very interesting provision. I really like that one, to allow any known prior use. And I would actually like to propose that idea of amending the national code to do what California does. But that's amending the code at the local level is somewhat easy. Amending it at the national level is a much more complicated thing. Now, very important note, in the International Existing Building Code, there is a statement that says an old plaster wall has a 1-hour fire rating. Extremely useful because that was such a common method of construction. So if it's on wood or metal lap, it says it's got a 1-hour rating. And there is an interesting document. It's an appendix in the International Existing Building Code. It's called the Fire Ratings of Archaic Materials and Assemblies. This is a research report that HUD paid for in the 1980s and put together. And it's extremely comprehensive, where they assembled all the old data on old building types of construction and what are the fire ratings. So this is an extremely useful document if you've got an old building and you've got a different kind of construction system in there that you're not familiar with. If it's in this document, you can say, code official, here's my equivalent. This shows that I have an hour rating or a 2-hour rating. One of the more frequent irksome issues that's come up to me is that it is not uncommon if you're doing a change of occupancy and putting residential use on the second floor, that the code now says you need a 2-hour rating on the ceiling of the first floor and then the floor of the second floor. And if you have an historic tin ceiling on the first floor, it really has about a 15-minute fire protection rating. So you don't have a 2-hour rating. But believe it or not, there's something called intumescent paint, and Fire-Free 88 is one brand of that. And you can paint a tin ceiling, and instead of being a 15-minute rating, you get a 1-hour rating by coating it with that. And if you have the other 1 hour of rating you can get from the ceiling or from the substrate or from insulation, there's a bunch of different ways you can modify the assembly to get to 2 hours. This has been a very efficient tool for improving the fire separation rating, where you don't have to remove the historic tin. And it's really pretty impossible to take a tin ceiling down and put it back again. They just don't come down easily and go back. So this is an interesting new technology, some way to make a building much safer. In a number of the historic communities I'm working with, it's very commonly used now for both tin ceilings and even sometimes wood and other substrates. So this is an interesting new technology on how to improve the fire protection rating of an older building system. In our workshop that's coming up, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about the fire safety performance method. And this is a separate method within the code that basically has 23 different categories of fire safety, and you get a scoring system. And you look at how big is the building, how many exits you've got, what's the fire rating of the materials, do you have sprinklers or not, what level of fire detection and alarm systems. And what this does extremely well is, instead of making the performance rating, put sprinklers in and you're okay, it gives you the code information for the code official that says, I made my building safer. I improved the alarm system, I improved the egress system, I improved the fire separation system, and all these things that I did gave me safety score points, and I scored enough safety points to meet this requirement. And this is where you get and cover the gray areas. So if you didn't get to a 2-hour rating, but you got to an hour and 50-minute rating, this system kind of takes that into account. So it really is very useful. It works very well for small Main Street buildings. And so if you're under 3,000 square feet, 2 stories, this system really works well. It's more complicated to use. Most code officials and architects don't know how to do it. Our training that's coming up in 2 weeks, we're going to spend 2.5 hours taking people through a detailed level of how to use this scoring system. And we're putting an Excel spreadsheet on how to use this on our APT website and providing it for free to everybody. So we really see the advantage of this, and we're spreading the word that this is a great new tool for fire protection evaluation. Now, within the historic building chapter, if you're a designated historic building, There's a number of things that are very specific to you that make it easier. It basically says historic stair rails and guards are grandfathered. So if you got an existing stair and guardrails and it's historic, the historic chapter says you can keep them, you can retain them and use them. What is implied in this is the use of a report to show equivalent levels of safety. So this really uses the design professional skills to say, okay, I've got an historic building, I want to keep this feature, it's significant, here's what I can do with that. Again, adding an intumescent paint if you want to do the rating system. In general, I will make a conclusion that if you put sprinklers in the whole building, generally most of the fire safety issues go away. So we know sprinklers work, they provide much greater level of safety for fire, but there are some things that you can, sometimes that becomes the most expensive option, and therefore the other options of approved alarm and detection and confinement become the more cost-effective ways to go. Now, the Energy Conservation Code takes the report format to a slightly different format, but it basically says if you have an historic building, the provisions of the Energy Code are not mandatory if a report's been submitted to the code official, and here's the exact words, demonstrating that compliance with the provisions would threaten, degrade, or destroy the historic form, fabric, or function of the building. So if you have your original wood windows, you do not have to replace them to make them to what the new energy performance standard would be, because it's the historic authentic feature. Now, if you don't have your original windows and you got vinyl replacement windows from the 1980s, that's not an authentic feature. So whoever's writing this report has to say what's there is authentic. And if it is, the code official is just to accept your word. The code official can agree that this applies. So the way this is written, it basically gives great authority to the design professional to make this assessment of both, is it an historic feature, and the action required would threaten or damage the character of the building. Where we've been seeing this used a bunch lately is people have exposed brick walls and they don't want to cover it up to put insulation in. And if it's a old warehouse and it's always been exposed, then that applies. So it's a little gray area. If originally it was a plaster wall and you took the plaster off to expose it, that's not necessarily the authentic feature. So that's a little gray in the zone about using this provision. But this is actually a response. Originally, the Energy Code exempted historic buildings. In 2018, that changed. The new version of the Energy Conservation Code was changed to the report format. So this, again, gives you flexibility, acknowledges historic buildings deserve special treatment, and gives that authority at the local level to make that decision. APT has been at the forefront of how to do that. We actually believe very much that we need to renovate our historic buildings and make them more energy efficient so they assure their long-term durability and deal with climate change issues. In addition to the energy code issues, a lot of the energy code issues refer to other technical standards. ASHRAE is the technical organization that works with energy efficiency. And we have a number of our APT members who are on the ASHRAE committee that developed this recent document on preserving historic buildings and saving energy, which has technical guidance. So if you're a design professional really getting into this topic, this right now is the best state-of-the-art document on the details of insulation in existing buildings. Interestingly enough, our APT technical committee on masonry is actually doing a workshop on energy retrofits of masonry walls, different techniques and tools for the best practices. There's a study committee working on that now that's on my radar. Now, amending the code, I'm going to speak about this at a couple of different levels. When you adopt the International Residential Code, and I'm going to move off of Main Street a little here because Main Street doesn't typically use the residential code, but I want to make a very important point here. The International Residential Code has no special provisions for historic buildings. So I find that nationally this is a big problem because the International Residential Code is the one most used for historic homeowners, and it says nothing about historic buildings. But the International Residential Code has a special appendix for existing buildings. And it's to encourage the continued or reuse of legally existing buildings with repairs. And it even says that technical infeasibility or disproportionate costs should be allowed by the building official to accept alternatives. And it's rare for a building code to say, hey, if it costs too much, you don't have to do it. But this provision allows that within the residential code. But there is a huge problem with that. When you adopt the International Residential Code, Appendix J doesn't automatically apply. You have to adopt it at the local level. So I find it very strange that the provision for existing buildings that's in the residential code isn't even automatically applied. You, as a local level or the state level or whoever's adopting the residential code, has to say, we're amending it to make sure this applies. So I'm very mystified by the way in which the International Residential Code has been developed with so little input for the residential marketplace. And I have a suspicion that the National Association of Home Builders is basically happy that it doesn't promote existing buildings and that they've got too heavy a hand in this. But we don't have in our level a strong residential committee working yet. So this is on our radar screen of something that the national preservation community's got to do more work on because the IRC is weak. But moving to this idea of amending the code on Main Street. In our research, we found lots of different places where people were amending the local code when they adopt it, both at the state level and at the local level. So Telluride, Colorado is an historic community, an old mountain and now tourism community in Colorado. Lots of historic resources, a very strong preservation commission. If you go to the city's website, you find they have the historic building enhancements to the International Existing Building Code. It's an extensive list of alternates for historic buildings. This is the kind of thing that we think could be extremely useful moving forward. And our APT Main Street Task Force, we put it on ourselves to develop what would be the best language to amend the code. So if you're looking, let's say a year from now, and you want to do something to make the code more useful at your level, your community is going to adopt the 2021 IEBC, we hope to develop an amendment. You can say, we wanted to add this amendment language to it, which would improve it for historic buildings on Main Street. So we're gathering the evidence of who's been amending it. We've got a number of these. We post this stuff on our APT Codes and Technical Standards website. So we're doing the research and working with our Main Street Task Force to basically go beyond that. So we're doing the heavy lifting to develop this. So we think this is going to be extremely useful for you moving into the future. So immediate action now is sign up for our workshop. The stuff I've talked today is kind of the tip of the iceberg. The 3-day training we've got coming up in August is going to be much more detailed about all these things. But now I hope you understand how important the building codes are to preservation and redevelopment. And one final note on this, if you were at the National Main Street workshop in Richmond this year, the town meeting, the National Main Street Center said making housing a part of your priority for your downtown should become more and more something on your work plan. Housing is critical to the future, getting those empty buildings used and looking at the areas around your downtown. So we think this code stuff is all related to the housing initiative. So these are all going to go together, and our task force is working with the National Main Street Center as it wants to move forward on this. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Thank you for attending this session today. And I think, Jerry, I'm kind of on target for my 10-minute questions and answers at the end.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike. Well, a lot of information covered in a really short amount of time. So thanks so much for giving that overview and helping build understanding about the IEBC and the opportunities and the limitations currently as well. Does anyone have any questions? I see there's a couple in the chat, so I will try and pull those back up if I can. Let's see.
Yeah, if you want to take the lead on reading the chat questions, and I'll try not to navigate it.
Sure. So Erin has her hand raised, but before we go to Erin, Lisa asked, how does lack of residential permits play into this? The apartments have been used but not permitted. Lisa, I'm not
Well,
sure I
actually,
captured
it's
that.
interesting that the term of art is the last known legal use. So if there's an illegal unit up there or they haven't been permitted, they haven't gone through the permit process, clearly you're starting, from a deficit because you got some conversion, something happened. And it's not totally uncommon, but it does mean your code official is going to say, well, let's see where you are with things, and you may have to do things. Most of the residential builders know about smoke detectors. That's pretty much ingrained now, but they may not be as aware of the different levels of increasing the alarms for multifamily or a building and doing some other things. So expect you're going to have to do something to improve it. I'm a big believer in the alarm systems and moving forward with them. You get a lot of points and making sure you've got your exit path open and clear.
Great, thanks, Mike. Erin, you have your hand raised, so go ahead and unmute yourself.
Looking for my unmute button. I am not going to have the right terms here, but I have a question about whether or not we talk to building officials about leeway with historic buildings in terms of the type of fire suppression system that gets recommended. And part of this is this idea of a commercial system is very different than some of the residential systems. And
okay.
If that makes sense, but in a historic building,
here's the deal. Okay. Yeah. No. We're going to do a whole 1-hour session on sprinkler systems and the difference between the commercial system, and there's 2 different levels of residential systems. The 13D and 13, I forget the other one, R. So I love the idea that if you're using the residential system on the 2nd floor, that should be allowed. If you're only going to do, and I got a 2-story building, I love the idea that you could just use the residential system. I found resistance from that from code officials where they say, no, once you've got to do sprinkler and you've got a mixed use building, it's got to be done to the commercial system on the 1st floor, which means the big water pipe coming in. And it's not the piping cost, it's the water supply cost and all that other stuff that goes with it.
Yeah.
So we're actually looking to kind of develop a better way in which that's interpreted for use of residential. I've seen examples where they've done it using the residential system because it uses plastic pipe, it uses the domestic water line. It's a much more affordable sprinkler system. So the nuances of that are a big part of our discussion. And the trigger that you've hit, the cost trigger, has been one of the things where we found people saying, I can't do housing upstairs because if I have to spend $50,000 to dig up the street and get a big 3-inch water line into my building, that $50,000 is out of my price range. That was the trigger point that stopped the project. And that we've heard that discussion come up over and over again. So you get to a financing gap on that issue, and that's a big one. But if you could put a residential sprinkler system on the 2nd floor and you're not doing anything to the 1st floor, that would be a much more efficient way to approach this. I can't give you the code text speak today on that to give you the answer, but it's kind of where we're heading, and we're hoping to develop model language and support case studies to show that.
Along those lines, though, also the difference between the 13D and the 13R sometimes impacts a historic building in a way that and some of this is in terms of the
13D has to, or the R, one of them has to go up in the attic and the closets and all these, and the lower level, the lowest level, just hits the main spaces. And I frequently quote Voltaire, don't make the perfect the enemy of the good. And I think that's one of the things that's happening here. The fire sprinkler code officials want everything. They want the massive system and all the spaces covered and all this. And I've seen reluctance on the code official people to go with the lower level of sprinklering. And yet we know it's cost effective because
Yeah.
this has become the make it or break it number all the time.
Understood. Thank you very much for that.
Yeah, yeah. So we're well aware of this. Our long-term goal is to get more training and examples to help clarify, because the code official, if they haven't heard of anybody else doing it, is reluctant to be the first person to do that.
Yeah.
So we want to
Awesome.
give them some knowledge base that, yeah, this is being done in other jurisdictions, and here's kind of the format for this.
Great. Thank you.
Sure.
EJ, we'll go to you, but just as a follow-up, Joy, if you're still on, have you seen any cases in Oregon where they've been able to go with that lower threshold in terms of the fire safety? I'm not sure if she's still on.
Sorry, helps when I unmute myself and put the mic down. No, I don't believe that has come into play. It is what Mike said. It's usually, if they're going to press it, it's going to be commercial all the way through. And that's pretty much the way it's been. Though in the past, I know we did have a rural county and city that was the building inspector was pushing for everyone to have sprinkler pipes, even though the local water supply did not have sufficient capacity to even have the fire sprinklers he was trying to tell them they all needed. So
Actually, it's actually in the code that if you don't have the water supply at the local level, you don't have to do it. And you know, this is that, oh well, if you're someday we'll get it, and then you'll have the, you know, it's like the long-term thinking, and it's unfortunate because we think there's a lot of safety to be gained from compartmentalization, passive and then active alarm controls. And I believe that the code officials have just been getting this message that only sprinklers are the safest. I had a very funny story with a Canadian man on our APT team, and every year he was the architect of record for the temporary ice hotel they built in Quebec City, where they literally stack blocks of ice up to make rooms, and you can bunk your room in the ice hotel. Well, when he went to the city and said, I need a permit for my temporary ice hotel, they said, well, since it's a hotel, it's got to have sprinklers. Now, this is a building made out of water, you know. And in the end, he didn't have to do sprinklers. But I'm telling you that story because the code officials have just got this mantra to themselves, you know, that only sprinklers are safe, and that's the only way we can do everything. And they've been pushing that message. And, you know, if you speak back to that message, you've got to speak to say there's alternative ways to be just as safe. And that's what we're promoting. We don't want our historic buildings to be less safe, but we think there's alternatives to get to there. And a combination of passive compartmentalization controls and alarms and detection can work with our small buildings to do that.
Okay. Thanks,
I think
Mike.
that was pretty, had entirely to do with my question, is because we have a building that they haven't done anything on their second floor because there's not enough water pressure on that side of the street. And the city said they would have to pay for bringing that pressure to the building. So does that fall in that same place of if the city can't provide it to the doorstep?
If the community doesn't have the water pressure, that's one thing. But if you have to dig up and go all across and pour under the street, you know, you've got this extra $50,000 to $100,000 at the front of the program that just isn't going to make it work. You know, you've already got a gap, and then that just adds to it.
So that doesn't fall under that code of saying that if it's not there, they don't have to do it. It is there.
You know, that's just it. No, see, that's really, this is where you have in rural communities without the water pressure to make it work. This is where you have it, but it's not on your side of the street. It's on the other side of the street. So
Great. Any other questions for Mike? Or Joe's still on the call as well, so feel free to ask. Let's see.
Camille, you probably can't see me. It's Lisa. I was just going to say that we've talked about a few buildings owners going together and bringing in that water across the street, and then we can go 4 buildings north and south once we pull it across. So just another idea, but we'd rather have the option of looking at it residential separately.
I do have another story. It's from one of the Kansas towns I'm working with, and they did a big streetscape program. This was Hutchinson, Kansas. And when they did their streetscape program, they actually did the water lines for all the buildings along Main Street with the higher capacity, because they said, hey, if we're going to dig up the street and do the sidewalks and do all this, this is the time to then upgrade the water line. And that was really good community planning and development to do that. It didn't tell the owners they had to put a sprinkler system in today, but with the water service to every building, the internal sprinkler piping isn't always a big cost barrier. It's that service to the building and all the system stuff that becomes the big cost. So, that was a good strategy.
Yeah, we have one question in the chat, then Mary Elizabeth has her hand raised. So we'll go to the chat. Camille asks, how do you communicate these codes to the residents? Is there outreach for potential tenants? Should they ask these questions before committing to a space?
Well, I think it's important for you as a Main Street manager to develop a relationship with both your city officials at the code level and at the development department level. That there's important new research and development going on codes, and making them to be part of the improved safety for the downtown and not a barrier. But it's building a coalition of people that support that, some key owners that understand these issues, as well as yourself. And if you can get your code official to attend this workshop, this will really help them, because they'll get lots of advice. And we've made this affordable for Main Street communities at our price point.
Yeah.
We're a far better bargain than other high-end technical sessions. So,
yeah. Thanks, Mike. And Mary Elizabeth, if you'd like to unmute yourself.
Yeah, sure. So I guess that, geez, anyways, I was kind of thinking about zoning and stuff. How hard is it to rezone a building into something residential? I think that's really clever and could potentially help solve the national housing crisis, you know, kind of shifting focus.
If your downtown has a zoning restriction against residential, that's pretty rare. That doesn't typically happen. Most downtowns, which are mixed use, allow the widest variety of uses. So if your downtown is has some restriction against residential, that is very uncommon. So
Mary Elizabeth, are you talking ground floor residential or
I was thinking second floor more so.
Yeah, I agree. That's pretty rare.
That's pretty rare.
Yeah.
So if your downtown residential or zoning ordinance doesn't allow residential use downtown, you need to say that's out of sync with what most towns have.
Okay. Yeah, I just don't have any idea. I'm on my like 4th day of the job. So it was just, yeah. Thank you guys.
Okay.
Now, this concludes our time for today. Thank you for tuning in. I hope those watching were able to take away something useful from the presentation. And as always, for more information, contact me, North Bend's Historic Preservation Officer, using the contact information on the screen. Bye for now.